Hi, I'm Carol Cottrell, and I had the honor of serving as mayor of the city of Saginaw from 2005 until 2007. In the year of 2007, Saginaw had the opportunity to celebrate its sesquicentennial, or 150th birthday. As a part of the celebration, we went back and interviewed former mayors who were still available to us to talk about what it was like to sit in the center chair at City Council and to give us their perspective on the events that took place and helped shape Saginaw to become the city it is today. We hope you enjoy the interviews, and thank you for being a part of Saginaw's history, its rich heritage, and its promising future.
Well, by 1961, I had been in Saginaw 7 years. Came here not knowing anybody except my wife's uncle's family, who was a doctor here, Dr. Clater. That's what brought us here. And I'd started a law practice from scratch by myself, and it had gradually caught on in those 7 years. I had become quite well known because, as you know, I am inclined to be verbose sometimes. And I was quite a writer. I had written to the Saginaw News because Saginaw, when I came here, was almost as bad racially as Mississippi, where I finished high school. Blacks could only live in the northeast section of the city. You simply could not buy a house, even where I live now over on Holland Avenue. I bought that house in 1966, and I was the first black to move inside Genesee Street. So housing here was a no-no for blacks. Now this is when I came in 1954. You could not go, if you were black, in any hotel. There wasn't anything but the Bancroft, I don't believe. But you were not acceptable in a hotel. You couldn't go in a bar and get served. And as I say, it was just about as bad as Mississippi. There were 6 black teachers in the entire school system. And at that time, there were thousands of students, much more than as you know now. There were 6 black teachers. And you can go on and on and on. Saginaw was not an open city. So, despite the fact that this was my background and I'd grown up through it, I had, between my previous experiences and the experiences here in Saginaw between the time I came in 1954 and 61, I had come to know many people, black and white, and to get a certain sense of my own self and my confidence. So I continually wrote to the Saginaw News about various things. I think you heard me tell one that I wrote a letter talking about the fact that it was easier for a black to go to a bank and borrow money to buy a Cadillac than it was to get a mortgage, because this same doctor who brought me, well, he didn't bring me, but who attracted me to Saginaw in the first place, very well known, very well to do, wanted to build a house out on Jane Street, and I had to buy the lot through Red Tucker, who was a white a druggist who had a store up on North Washington, near where, North 6th, near where my office was. Red Tucker bought the lot and in turn conveyed it to me. That's how Dr. Clater bought a place. So Saginaw was not showing its real potential, let's say that. So, but as I say, things gradually begun to change, not just because of me. Another young lawyer came here, Ralph Selby, who lived here but practiced in Bay City. And other people, through activities that we developed black organizations that were dedicated to opening the city, and there were people who were willing to follow and willing to do. And so things gradually begun to open up. No black, as far as I know, had ever been elected to any office, with the possible exception that Harry Brown, who was on the Board of Commissioners, I don't know whether he was elected or appointed. He ran for council in 1959 and was defeated, despite the fact that he was the outstanding black leader and black labor leader in Saginaw. Well, oddly enough, I'm still in the JCs and I'm meeting other people and making friends. And I made many white friends in this community who discovered that I was reasonably human, and we undertook things together. So in 1959, the JCs, which was then the strongest leadership group in the community, Junior Chamber organized this so-called Committee of 50. It was totally white. Now, I'm a member of the JCs, but I wasn't invited to join this. But this Committee of 50 was devoted to political movement. They ran a slate for the council in 1959, and they were successful. But there were no blacks on it. Well, in 1961, they came to me and asked me if I ran, if they supported me, would I run? Now, Mark, there's still no blacks in it. And these are friends of mine. I knew most of them because they were young, up-and-coming leaders. So they asked me, would I accept if I was nominated by them? I said yes. So I was nominated. They nominated a slate of 4. Jim Stingline, whose uncle had been mayor here and who was very well known, an up-and-coming young lawyer who was a friend of mine, architect from, he couldn't have lived in Frankenmuth, he couldn't have been, I've forgotten his name, but an architect, and Benny Marxer, who ran a bar downtown known as Marxer's Stag Bar, which incidentally I had never been served in either. So they nominated the 4 of us for the council. We ran together. We had I've got pictures at home now of the slate and so forth. Well, we ran in the slate as a slate, and 3 out of the 4 were elected. And that came as a surprise to a lot of people. But what was even more surprising was the one black on the slate led the slate in the entire city. Well, when I survived and finally thought about it, needless to say, I was pleased. I didn't have any political ambitions, and that's true. But I did, in line with what I was trying to do to build this community, I had felt the duty to try to, if I could do this thing successfully, I did. So here I am in the city council. Well, normally, the person who led the slate, if there were not led, it didn't have to be a slate, but who led those people who were running, normally the leader was elected mayor. But that was not an absolute, but it was tended to be the custom. Well, I didn't quite think that Saginaw was at the point of accepting its first black mayor, a black councilman, and then making him mayor. So my name never came up, and I really never expected it to. Stu Frankie was elected. And in my mind, Stu Frankie was the best mayor overall, with all due respect to the prettiest mayor. Stu Frankie was the best mayor we've had in Saginaw, I think, to this day. Well, everything went fine. For the next 4 years, I worked in the community, black side, white side, anywhere. Got to be very well known. And I would think my term as councilman was reasonably successful. So, 4 years later, needless to say, I ran again. Guess what? I forgot whether we ran with a slate that time or not. But anyhow, again, I led all over the city. I think in every precinct, but just about every precinct. Well, by then I had enough successes that I was beginning to develop a little ego. So I thought, well, maybe I ought to throw my hat in the ring for mayor. Well, the way we elected the mayor was the council, after the election, would get together down at the Bancroft Hotel in a private meeting and talk out who's going to be the mayor. Anybody who wanted to be threw their hat in the ring. So this time, much to the surprise, I think, of my cohorts, when it came around, I said, I'm in. Well, we sat there and debated for probably 2 hours. And ultimately, the three, what I would call weak members, and I don't use that literally, but these were the three people who were the least recognized. One was a labor man, one was, well, anyhow, supported me. The other four, who were the best known, most widely accepted, ultimately ended up supporting Jim Stingline. Well, Jim had as much right to be mayor as I did. His uncle had been mayor before him. Jim had been an excellent councilman. And so there's nothing derogatory I can say, except I think by virtue of the history of this thing, I felt even after it was over that I was more entitled to it, but that was my opinion. So Jim Stingline was elected mayor, and I was elected mayor pro tem. Well, when the meeting was over, we got up, and it was a cordial meeting. Nobody got mad and slammed things around. I said, well, who's going down to the Saginaw News and tell Glenn Boysenall, the editor, that I wasn't elected mayor? Because he's got an editorial already written with pictures of me and my dog to publish Sunday. So somebody better go down there and tell him to pull that editorial. Well, you talking about some dismayed looks, and that was diabolic on my part, I admit. So when I let it sink in, I said, don't worry, I'll go. And I went down to the news. Glenn was a good personal friend, as have most of the editors at the news been. So I went on to Glenn, told him the story. And I said, don't make anything of it, please. Don't write any upset, derogatory stories. They did what they felt was right. So that was the end of it for that 2-year period. When the next period came up in 1967, I was elected mayor without any great dissent, although I know Paul Wimler ran against me. But I was elected mayor in 1967. That is a somewhat lengthy story of my being mayor. Well, like I've said, Saginaw had most growing cities challenges. But on top of it, we still had those racial problems. Now, I'd gotten to the place where I could go into most public places without fear of rejection, and other blacks were being accepted more. But we had racial problems. Jobs, we could get any job there was as long as it was labor in the plants. So while there was plenty of employment, it was not the kind of employment that many people were qualified and desirous of. So there was the housing problem that I've already talked about. There were the schools, which were still segregated, just as housing was segregated. So from my point of view, particularly as a black, segregation was as much of a problem as it had been. But I had a view which I later learned was not acceptable to certain segments of the community. I believed that I was the mayor of Saginaw, not the mayor of the east side where the blacks lived and who had supported me strongly. I believed that I was the mayor of Saginaw, and Saginaw's problems were mine, and I tried to be as honest as I could with blacks and whites. And so we had then all the problems that, as I said, growing cities had. The General Motors plants were thriving, and generally speaking, economically, we were doing very well. But still, Saginaw was, well, it was just in need of good leadership, which piloted us in the right directions. And that's what I tried to do. So when problems came up, we talked about them. We didn't talk about black problems as such. We talked about them as community problems. So I tried to build community organizations, mixed black and white, that were able to adopt common goals and this kind of thing. But that was basically Saginaw. It was no different, not an awful lot different from what it is now. And what puzzles me is one of the things we concentrated on back then was building leadership. And as you know, today, what are we concentrating on? Building leadership. Where'd they all go? Nothing of any great significance, but having tempered to the age of 85, perhaps I'm softening a little bit. I might have, and it's still a might, tried to cultivate this black-white group that I later discovered was so resentful of my type of leadership. I knew they were there. There was the black group called the United Power, which was an imitation, if you're old enough, and I've spoken to some audiences recently that aren't old enough, but if you're old enough to remember Stokely Carmichael and his Black Power group, well, Stokely's group was the same as this. It had many white members who supported his idiocy. And the group here, and before we started, I named you some of the people who were in it. It was largely composed of white clergy, mainly, I think I could verify, Catholic. But there were Episcopals, and there were white and black Protestants, to be fair about it. But this group was of the strong opinion that the only way to change things was through either force and violence or threats. And that I did not agree with, and I made it plain that I didn't. And so we had open disagreements. I never really was conciliatory toward them because I disliked them. But I think if there's anything that I would have tried to do differently, I would have tried to be more conciliatory, though even now I don't think it would have worked. They thrived on two things: hating Uncle Toms like me, and this was my characterization with the black militants and the white liberals, because of the fact that I was conciliatory towards whites. So I was the prize, and still am to this day, Uncle Tom in this community with those type people. So that, if I could and change my mind, would be the one thing. But I sort of resolved the guilt, if there is any, by telling myself it wouldn't have done any good, and I don't think it would have. So I think we were on the right track. I had a solid group of whites who were backing me, who were successful people in this community. I was on a first name basis with every plant manager of any, oh yes, Joe Godfrey, Mark McKay. We were all friends. And this was part of the Reuben Daniels thing with the jobs. These people, when they had a problem, if they thought I could help, they'd call me. And when I had one, I would call them. And these were the kinds of relationships that we built. If Uncle Tom, if that was Uncle Tom, so be it. But we had built a solid cadre of blacks: Harry Brown, Reuben Daniels, Roosevelt Austin, and many others that I can't stop to name. Tom Woods, who to me was the prize white in terms of just understanding and humaneness. Tom Woods worked as the deputy assistant to the head of the United Way. Tom Heatherman. Tom Heatherman. Tom was my main man, but Tom Heatherman. But Tom Woods was, when it came a time to cry on somebody's shoulder, I'd usually go talk to Tom Woods because he was humane, he was understanding, discerning. But we had a group of blacks and whites who were leaders in this community who knew how to work together. And that was something that was very heartening. But the more we worked together, the bigger Uncle Tom I became in these other groups. As I'll tell you later, if I get to that part of the story, the day that our demonstrations took place downtown, there was a white Episcopalian minister on the corner at Citizens Bank, presumably directing activities. Now, I say presumably. I didn't hear him, but from what I later discovered. Well, a lot of them were minor things, like organizations that you created who took on pride. And a lot had happened here in Saginaw that I don't remember now in terms of specifics, but we had organizations, the committee. We had established a Human Relations Commission. I was the first chairman. And I think this was before I went on the council, because I think I resigned after I became chairman. But the Human Relations Commission had done a lot of effective work with the police, for instance, with whom we'd had some problems. And it was a cogent force. Later, it sort of got co-opted by this other group, because I guess maybe they swallowed the theory of victimization, which you heard me talk about. In all charity, if they needed to, the whites that I have had the most difficulty with, I give a lot of them credit for the goodwill, intending to do the right thing. But I think they had wholeheartedly swallowed this theory of victimization, which came up during this time. In order to relieve their guilt, they came up with this theory that blacks were victims that because of the numerous wrongs we committed in society, Lord knows I don't apologize for them, but they were there and they were wrong. That our wrongs were due to the fact that we were victims. And the truth of the matter is, we were victims. But to me, that was no excuse. So my feeling was, victim or no, you work to correct the wrong. And you've heard me, if you don't mind my using it, because it's the only piece of poetry I think that I remember. But it has been a guiding light in my life. And this certainly was my feeling about victimization. It's a poem I learned in the 8th grade down in Camden, Alabama, where you wouldn't think of little blacks learning poetry at all. It was a United Presbyterian mission school. And this is what guided me during many, many a dark moment. It's called the Invictus. It matters not how straight the gate, and that's S-T-R-A-I-T to you people who don't. It matters not how straight the gate, how charged with punishment the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Now that, I believe, as firmly as I believe anything in the Bible, maybe more firmly with my life, because I have always felt, and my father and my mother reinforced this as long as I can remember. You're a man and you're responsible for yourself. And I believe that to this day. And I have never made excuses, not by victimization for my failures, and I've had numerous failures. But this was where a lot of whites managed to assuage their sense of guilt. Because they say, I'm going to help these poor, whatever they call them over here, because society has not done them right. And they excuse us for everything. We couldn't do wrong. Well, you don't excuse me if I go out here and commit a murder and you say Henry is black, and I understand because society has done this to him. You don't excuse me if you do that. You insult me. And blacks, even though many of them knew better, took advantage of it. And that is what I think, and I hope to this day some of them correct me, I think that's what sidetracked a lot of whites who could have done a lot of good, but on the other hand, did their best to sidetrack some of the good things we wanted to do. Now, the high points. In July of 1967, which was the year I was elected mayor, had been elected in April, the disturbances, which you don't remember probably, had developed all over the country. Martin Luther King had done his best, and I started to say he spoke my language. I wouldn't doubt, but what I learned a lot of my language and thinking from Martin Luther King, because he believed the things that I'm telling you I believe now, that the only way that the wrongs in this country could be worked out would be by conciliation and working together. Well, these blacks and these whites, who were the militants, rejected that completely. So Martin Luther King had been murdered, the riots had broken out, and Detroit got to Detroit, and they actually had riots. This was July, particularly of '67. Well, we were pretty sure we were going to get problems here. And in fact, in July, we got a demand from, and they never asked, demand from United Power to talk to the council. Not at a regular council meeting, which we would have had to grant to somebody, but a demand to talk to us elsewhere. Well, we refused it, but said that the mayor, the manager, and the chief of police will talk with a selected group of a few of your people. Scheduled it down to Bancroft Hotel. The three of us went down there, and I had the complete help and support of the manager and the chief of police. Got a badge at home now. We went down to meet three of their people, two of whom are still alive and here in this community, came down to meet with us. Well, nothing came of the meeting, and we hadn't expected it would, because they were not asking us for things that we either were doing or could reasonably do. They were demanding, do this, do that. Well, nothing came of it. By the time we walked out of the hotel, to show you how this was contrived, there were a bunch of blacks sitting out in the middle of Genesee and Washington at Citizens Bank in Bancroft, blocking traffic. They were sitting there. This tells you something about how it occurred. The same person I told you who was on the corner, sprinkled around were others, and there were blacks there. Well, I guess the word got around that we had rejected them. So they did a lot of talking, not to us, we weren't there. But they made their speeches and blocked the street. And later on they took off, went on a little pier and started out east. And ultimately ended up at a place that you may or may not know about. It was Tony's Restaurant then over on the pier right at 6th Street. All right. That's where they ended up gathering. They knocked a few windows out on the way, set fire to a few places, but which were quickly controlled, and got out there and gathered for whatever they were going to do. Well, the police were there by the time they got there. Roy Thune, who was a police captain, was in charge of the detail, and I still thank the good Lord for Roy. He dealt with them and talked with them, and despite their utmost efforts, they were not able to provoke any real confrontations with the police. I understand I wasn't there. I understand there was some minor things, but really it was controlled. So there went the big demonstration. At the next council meeting, I made a statement, and I had intended to bring it, but unfortunately my wife was cleaning house and I couldn't find it today. But I made a statement of which I am proud of this day, and I had intended to read a part of it to you. But ultimately, I tried to point out the things that we had done that were effective. The idiocy of what they said when they proudly boasted that they were speaking to the pimps, the prostitutes, and so forth, and that if there was not a peaceful listening to them, then they take other means. I got that in my statement, quoting them. And I ended up my statement saying that while we would do everything we could in this community to accommodate the needs of anybody who was a citizen, the law was going to be enforced, and that was the end of that. So things sort of quieted down for a while, but I knew we had to do something. So I got with my brain trust, Harry, the two Toms, two or three other people, and we decided that we should call together a meeting of all the pros and cons who wanted to participate to talk about Saginaw, where we were, what we'd really done wrong, and I'm sure we had, what we'd done right and where we ought to go. We called this meeting, and there were probably 300-400 people there. Black, white, management, everything. And it was a let down your hair meeting. Tom Woods, that I mentioned earlier, presided, and he was an ideal moderator because they couldn't provoke him. And everybody got to speak. If you wanted to speak, speak. No holds barred. And people let go on both sides. It was a venting session, and it was, I think, from the point of view of what we were trying to do right then, successful. Fact is, when we got through, we sang We Shall Overcome. And down on the very front row was Joe Godfrey, whose name may not mean anything. He was general manager of steering gear. Down on the front row was Joe Godfrey, holding hands as we did with We Shall Overcome, with a guy whose name was Edward Beeman, but who was a great militant who called himself Sultan the Shawan. There was Joe and Sultan the Shawan standing there singing, We Shall Overcome. I've never forgotten that. So, as a result, we decided we would appoint committees to deal with some of the specific problems we had talked about that day. Open housing, jobs, schools, and particularly schools from the point of view of technical training. And I think, and I always have a problem remembering the fourth one, but I think it was simply discrimination generally. But anyhow, I know those three. So we didn't assign committees. You volunteered for the committee you were on. So there was no militant who could say, I couldn't do this. Well, ultimately ended up with some pretty good sized and well diffused committees. And they met for months. And they met. So when they finally came back for the recommendations, there was a recommendation that we should build a school that taught skills in various things, and we should put Reuben Daniels out at what became the Daniels Center and ask employers if they would agree that if Reuben sent them people who were qualified for a position, no matter what it was, if they were qualified, they would hire them. That was a recommendation. And recommended the council pass an open housing ordinance. And there was a fourth, as I say, but I can't think what it was. Well, these were things that we had already been working on, but had not reached a peak on. So, as a result of these recommendations, directly as a result of these, the Walter Averill Career, whatever it is, Center was built out on White Street. We passed a special 8 mil tax in order to build that. That was one of the recommendations of what we had come to call the Committee of Concern. Another, as I say, was that employers agree to accept people who were qualified for jobs no matter what. The major employees at every one of these plants that I'm telling you about agreed to it, and they kept their word as time went on. The city council passed an open housing ordinance, and mark you, even at that time, I was the only black who lived inside Genesee. There were 2 or 3 families on the west side who had been here for years and years before discrimination became so bad. There was blacks on the south side, but I moved to Genesee in 1966, and I was still the only black there. And incidentally, one of my neighbors, who was a very well-known General Motors manager, and his wife came over within a couple of days and brought a cake. That's for Uncle Tom. So, there were, the city council, as I said, passed the open housing ordinance with one dissenting vote, whose name I shan't call because he's still alive. We passed it. The realtors, who were very sure of themselves, immediately got the necessary signatures to put it on the ballot to rescind it. Well, we called our support together, black and white, and we had support in this community. When it came to a vote, the ordinance was upheld in every precinct in the city, with the exception of one, and the difference there was 59 votes. There, I think, was a victory, because I knew what discrimination was like in this community. So those are 3 of the direct things that were accomplished by the Committee of Concern. There were other things, but now, here we are. We got some stuff to boast about. Without my knowledge, Ed Potter, the city manager, submitted the record of what we had done to Look magazine and the National League of Cities, who each year back then selected 10 All-America cities. I didn't know it. First thing I knew, Ed called and said, hey, they're having the finals on selection of All-America cities, and we've been invited to make a presentation. I want you to go. Well, Harry, Tom, at least 1 or 2 of Ed's staff, and I went out to New Orleans and made our case. And Saginaw was elected as an All-America city, 1 of 10 in the country. Now, this was sometime during the next spring. It would have been spring of 1969, because that's when I went out of office. Well, part of the All-America Cities thing was that Look magazine and National League of Cities would come to the city and interview people and make a presentation, and eventually there would be a presentation by Look and All-America Cities. Look came here and interviewed people that they wanted to interview, including me. The article came out just before we had a celebration schedule. The article came out. My name was mentioned in a paragraph about this long. Art Smith, who was the biggest nemesis I had and who to this day knows I don't like him, Art Smith got twice as much space as I. He was the head, one of the heads of Black Power. Twice as much space as I got in the story, and they did not mention any of the accomplishments that I've just told you about. Not one. Now, this was the story in Look magazine supporting us for All-America City. So, when this came out, it just sort of, but we had this big celebration. And at that time, we didn't have the new Civic Center. We had the Civic Center downtown. On the night of that, the center was packed to the rafters. And we had some happy people down there. But guess what was outside demonstrating? Black power and their constituents. They were demonstrating. They had been featured in the Look article that I just told you, and I still have the article. And they had said that we weren't entitled to anything, but Saginaw's pride sort of just overcame that. But this was the ultimate. And I still have at home the headline. But to wrap up the story, guess who wasn't there for dinner? Look magazine. I went to the council. I said, I want you permission to tell them they aren't welcome. We told them, don't come here, don't set foot in Saginaw. The president of Look magazine called me, and I told him in the language I won't use on this what I think. And on the night of the presentation, it was the National Look of Cities in Saginaw. That is the story of all America's cities at some length. The night that I stood in front of that audience in all America's cities and told them what I thought about Look magazine in cleaned up language, how proud I was of them, how much I love them in this community. That's the proudest moment I had and the proudest I'll ever have. Knowing my parents as I do, I think they'd tell me you did a pretty good job in just about that language. Well, yeah, they'd have been surprised at that. They'd have been surprised. But I don't think they would have been totally surprised at my being reasonably successful, because my father was a leader. He was a failure as a farmer. He was a high school principal in Alcoa, Tennessee, where the aluminum company is located. But he got fired because of his temper, which I inherited. My mother, my parents were both college graduates, believe it or not, during these times. But they had taught us what led me to believe the Invictus. So they wouldn't have been totally surprised, because they tried to prepare us for this. So they'd have been proud, but they wouldn't have been totally surprised.